Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dave Chadwick. Dave's here at Bangor University and he's going to give us the context of science and agriculture, and his specialism is particularly looking at pollution, and also what he's going to do is pick up where we're going with agriculture and science in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and given this opportunity to speak today. I'm going to sort of fly the flag for agricultural production as an ecosystem service, because I'm not sure we've heard quite enough about that from what through the sessions I've sat in anyway. I'll give you a brief context really of the agricultural system within Wales. Please don't think that Bangor University only looks at Welsh agriculture. We do have lots of work and research of international reputation throughout the world, but it's my focus today. I'm going to talk about some sustainable agricultural production and some of the research that we have been conducting over the years here within Wales to that agenda, and then move a little bit forward into the sustainable agricultural intensification agenda, only just to provoke a little bit of discussion more than anything else, with some loose points about future research directions and conclusions. So just by way of a summary, Welsh agriculture is pretty special. We have about 1.5 million hectares of agricultural land, and you'll see from that agricultural land classification that a vast majority of that is grade 3 or above. We have very, very little high grade 1, grade 2 land. Where it's dominated by arable land. It's there within the Conwy catchment, if we can find it somewhere. And, that supports around 40,000 different farm holdings. Because of the nature of the climate, the topography, the soil types that we have here, what we can do quite well here is grow grass. And because we have grass, the agricultural productivity that we tend to have, of course, there is ruminants. So we're strong on the dairy and particularly on the beef and the sheep. Just to reinforce that, so you can see here, we are basically dominated by grassland agriculture, whether that be the permanent grassland or the more high, rough, mountain grassland areas. Now, agriculture is inherently polluting. I could put a graph up like this for the UK, for Europe, for the world. This is for Wales. This is based on a recent report that shows you the agricultural contribution to these various different pollutants. Just because we disturb the soil means we're going to end up enhancing mineralization, potentially increasing nitrate leaching. The fact that we apply fertilizers, we apply manures, is going to enhance that even more. Of course, there are other sources of these pollutants out there. That's why agriculture is not 100% the contributor. And because we understand that agriculture contributes towards pollution, there are a whole raft of environmental targets that have already been discussed to some extent. The EU has targets, the UK has targets, and within the UK, Wales has some of its own particular targets. So within the greenhouse gases, within the UK, we need to reduce our emissions by 80% by the year 2050. Within Wales, there is another obligation to actually reduce a 3% year-on-year reduction. European governments are looking at ways to quantify the actual water quality that they have in terms of maintaining and restoring ecological good to waterways. So there's all sorts of information out there for farmers to try to manage their land in such a way that doesn't impact so much on water quality. We've heard about how we missed the 2010 biodiversity targets. Ammonia emissions have been mentioned in this room already today. There are bioenergy targets that are going to result in calls on land. And I've put also down there organic matter to landfill, mainly because it's one of those areas that's very close of research that's close to my heart. Every kilogram of organic matter produced that is not going to landfill is being targeted back at agriculture, which is a great thing. It's very positive, but if it's not managed in the right kind of way, it can even exacerbate some of those potential pollution problems. So the question we have is how to manage our agricultural production in a sustainable way. How to provide this safe and nutritious food and safeguard the environment. Is it through lower input systems with lower outputs or not? So I want to give you a few examples of some of the research that's taken place, coordinated or taking place here within Wales, that's trying to look at how to make agriculture more sustainable. One of the projects that I lead is this large UK multi-partner consortium to actually improve the way in which we report on the agricultural nitrous oxide emissions inventory, to make our inventory much more specific to the soils, the climate, the management systems that we have in the UK. And as part of that, and we have sites throughout the UK, including in Wales, as part of that, we're looking at mitigation methods. Specifically, in this case, we're looking at the use of chemical inhibitors to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, to improve nitrogen use efficiency. And this is an example where a nitrification inhibitor reduces the N2O, the nitrous oxide emission, from urine deposition by around 60%. Closer to home, we have PhD work looking at what are farmers' perceptions to climate change, what influences farmers' behaviour to pro-environmental management on farms in terms of greenhouse gas emission mitigation. So we're assessing the potential of clover, for example, with research on the ground, with measurements to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. We're supplementing that with carbon footprinting and looking at how farmers respond to different drivers and how that impacts on the carbon footprinting, with a view to progressing whether we're going to meet the red meat roadmap that's been produced here in Wales. We've already seen an example, we've already seen this slide almost actually from Bridget. I guess there's just one other component I would add to this, and that is there is this uncertainty within pollution research about what is the source of pollutants. Phosphorus equally comes from, well, the jury's out what proportion it comes from, but it's a source of pollution for phosphorus would be the sewage treatment works, the cesspits within agricultural areas, as well as the actual phosphorus inputs from the farms. And that's quite important in terms of knowing that source apportionment, same with fecal indicator organisms, in terms of tackling that source of pollution, that source of pollution, and that polluter pays principle, who should actually be really paying for that. An example of some of the trade-offs if we don't quite get it right here is this is the potential use of forage crops in agri-environmental schemes to encourage bird life. So lapwing, yellowhammer, they like this sort of the standing forage, and farmers can see that as attractive as well. Attractive in terms of reducing overwintering costs for feeding their stock, actually in terms of trying to expand their stock without having to invest in quite expensive infrastructure and housing. But if we get that wrong, and as is the case in this particular example, it's not in all cases, but in this example, we can really do a lot more harm than good. The soil compaction results in less infiltration of rainfall. High rainfall then, in excessive infiltration, means we're going to have excess runoff and risk of erosion, risk of greater greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I guess the lesson here is, although we might have the best intention, and 9 times out of 10 this system might work, there are occasions when we actually are going to cause more harm than good. Talking of forage protein production, a project led by our colleagues over at Aberystwyth, although that we're actively involved with, is looking to see whether we can improve or encourage greater uptake of sustainable forage protein grown on our own farms, thus reducing the reliance on buying it in from sources overseas that could be resulting in indirect land use change. And our component of this is to try and assess the environmental impacts of this, as well as the more productive economic effects. And finally, in terms of the examples I want to tell you about, we've got all the work going on the ground in terms of research. We put those messages out through outreach activities, but we also have this example of the Advanced Training Partnership that works between Aberystwyth University, who lead this, ourselves, and NIAB TAG. Yes, it's focused on pastoral systems, but it's all about upskilling the agri-food sector with the latest research that we have, such that people within the workplace can register and work their way through to MScs and Prof Docs. And it's all about delivering research into industry, and some of those modules include things like ecosystem services, agriculture in society, life cycle analysis, carbon footprint, etc. So really relevant to sort of the things that we're talking about today. Now, you've seen this slide, or at least the graph on the right, several times, but it's just as an aide-memoire, really. I mean, I think we all understand that there are going to be trade-offs. When we come to think about how we produce food, fibre, energy from land. How can we actually optimize those? It's all scale dependent. It is spatially complex, as I learnt earlier on this week, and I'll come back to that. So in terms of our Welsh context, and you can think about this in any context, to be honest with you, it's spatial prioritisation of land management is important if we want to achieve these multiple ecosystem services. The photograph on the right is, we were very lucky. We are being fast-tracked through the advanced glass tier system at the moment on our farm here at Henvice, and just 10 kilometres down the road along the A55. We had our glass tier advisor out this week, and it was the worst day you could have possibly imagined to go and visit parts of the farm. Although there was a rainbow, we were under torrential rain. But she was doing her absolute best to help us make very complex decisions about where to spatially put increased woodland or some streamside corridors. In other words, and for example, where best to, which parts of our land we were going to be happiest with in terms of managing the sward height, which meant either mob stocking at certain times of the year or absolutely reducing the stocking at very key times of the year to actually deliver swards that would encourage certain bird species, etc. Now, at the same time, this farmer, we're fortunate there's a lot of sort of professors around the table, but these are complex decisions that have to be made, and farmers have to make a decision about the points they're going to earn from these glass tier measures that are fixed costs today, and will be fixed costs for the next 5 years, I assume, it's not index linked, with the market price that they're going to achieve for any particular livestock product. And we know how quickly that fluctuates within Welsh agriculture anyway. So they've got this balance. And of course, they may even have a third income, which will be an off-farm income that they have to have anyway to keep the place going. They might be lorry drivers or whatever. So it's pretty complicated decisions that we're asking farmers to make at the farm scale. At the higher scale, I would say that glass tier is probably done quite well in trying to think about how it can prioritise mitigating or delivering ecosystem services at this national scale. So it has targeted specific areas where it hopes to encourage more carbon sinks or reduce diffuse water pollution. And in those areas within Wales, it's actually trying to target specific mitigation methods and encourage, incentivise that within that area. So it's complex in terms of the regional perspective as well as, I say, the on-farm perspective. And if, this is just me being provocative, but if it is the case that a farmer decides that he's going to back off the production, take more of the ecosystem service payments through glass tier, one has to question, if we still have the same demand for food, where's that being picked up? Are we in the luxurious position in Wales or wherever to say we're going to target biodiversity, but someone else can end up polluting and produce the milk or the meat or something else somewhere else in the world? So it's just a question we have to think about the boundaries. And on that basis, this is the current situation. We do have to feed the growing population. This is just we always hear the global number. I thought I'll just put about the Northern European target here, 20% by 2050. In that scenario, how are we going to deliver these multiple ecosystem services? What's going to be optimal land use? Where are the barriers, the limitations, etc.? And I would say that actually we can get quite a long way there just from some of the evidence that I've seen over the years, just by getting the basics right first. This is the Conwy catchment. This is a survey of 50 farms, 2 fields in each farm. I think we covered about 12% in terms of the land area of the whole of the Conwy catchment. But just through some basic surveys of the soils, we showed that actually over 70% of those soils really required liming. There's been a lack of investment by farmers to lime. It doesn't matter how much fertiliser the farmer applies, he's not going to get, or she's not going to get, most efficient use of the fertiliser or the manure that they're applying if the pH is not right. So just by improving the pHs of the soils, we can become a much more efficient farming system, produce more, probably with less in terms of fertiliser input. So first of all, we can get somewhere towards the yield gap just by getting the basics right. I haven't heard anyone mention this, and maybe it's a sort of an old chestnut now, but we can think of potentially improving the ecosystem delivery through the use of land sparing as opposed to land sharing. I'm sure, just in case you're not aware, I'm sure you're all aware, but land sparing basically is saying, can we increase yields on smaller areas of land and therefore release areas of what might be considered now agriculture productive land, or land that's being used for productivity, to deliver other ecosystem services, as opposed to what we might be thinking of now, which is tinkering around the edges, integrating agriculture and ecosystem services on the same area of land. And just because I felt like it, I thought I'd show a little picky. So this is land sharing. This is just basically saying this is the kind of productivity we get on an area. You can think of this as a field, a farm, a catchment, possibly even a region. So it's delivering agriculture, and the green in the background there is delivering some other ecosystem services. What we're saying with land sparing is, can we, through whatever methodologies, technologies that we have at hand that we're working on in terms of the science, increase productivity within the smaller land area and release that other land where we can really go to town and deliver much more of these particular ecosystem services. So, for example, I know we might put more animals onto an area of land and that will generate more methane, for example. Can they be offset by carbon storage that would be on that land that's spared? And does it also deliver other things like biodiversity? Now, land sparing in a Welsh context might be quite tricky, might be quite limited, but there are potentials. As I said, in the lowland areas, which is where most of our dairying would potentially be, in the higher beef productivity areas, getting the basics right will get us so far. There's technological advances that I'll talk about in a moment that could also enhance that. There's also the opportunity to improve some of those upland areas, those mid-Frith areas, up to sort of 300, 350 metres, as long as they're not too steep. And that has been, in the past, an era where greater lime and nutrient inputs were put up there. But there's still a potential to improve those. But of course there's some conflicts there, because that's the kind of land that might be thought of for other ecosystem services, for woodland planting, for increasing carbon storage, and if they're put in the right places, potentially reducing risk of flooding. And then we have the opportunity to maybe intensify both the lowlands and some of the upland areas. But by just concentrating on some of those areas, maybe we can enhance and spare land further up the mountain. As I say, there are potential limitations to this in Wales, not least because of the topography, the soils and the climate. I mean, bracken, Pteridinium aquilinum, is a real issue here in Wales, as it is in many parts of the uplands. That takes up an awful lot of land. If we could get on top of that, then we have the opportunity to improve some productivity there. As I've already mentioned, there are other important ecosystem services that could be delivered on these Frith areas. Wales has fairly small farms. That might limit to some degree what could be done. Maybe there's potential for cooperative approaches. But the other thing to bear in mind here anyway in Wales is this complex relationship between livestock production in the lowlands and how it interacts with the uplands, because the stock spend periods of time in both areas. And just simply saying we're going to take over a lot of the Frith land for forestry would probably mean we would have to back off production down on the lowland unless we decided to import more feeds or put animals into housing or whatever. The common grazing areas, that's even more interesting politically, because you have areas of land up on the tops of the mountains that are shared by various landowners. So there's got to be real cooperation should farmers want to really engage with, for example, some of the glass tier measures. And then just to complicate things even further, we do still have this sort of transhumance, where we do take stock, where farmers do take stock from areas in Wales to other areas of the UK at different times of the year to help with the production cycle. So what have we got that we can sort of offer in terms of future research? I say Welsh context, but this could apply anywhere, really. Well, I think we really need to think about how we can quantify. It's all about quantification, really, to be able to inform policymakers, decision makers, etc., what the pros and the cons are. So quantifying the impacts of management options to increase production at various scales. So we could think about alternative management systems, so zero grazing, cutting and carrying, but that means greater use of imported feeds. Improving the upland areas, as I've already mentioned. The potential choice of more productive livestock breeds, just increasing the potential lambing percentage, but it increases the labour associated with it. And there are wider system boundaries, I think I've already intimated. Greenhouse gas emissions associated with fertiliser, feed, bedding, production may invoke indirect land use change elsewhere. In terms of the technological advances to enhance sustainable production, I would suggest that, the likes of Aberystwyth University, ourselves at Bangor, and there'll be other Welsh institutions, there's a lot of research going on right now that's all about trying to improve pasture species, to enhance carbon sequestration, to improve soil structure, nutrient uptake, water use efficiency, etc. There's also work on improving the livestock themselves through ruminant nutrition. That might be through genetics or through diets, to reduce methane emissions and excretion. And in terms of resource management, all sorts of work that we need to be doing in terms of improving the utilization of nutrients in some of these new organic resource streams that are being targeted at land. And of course, we can't forget soil. Investment in soils research is absolutely fundamental to moving forwards. So to conclude, I would argue that agricultural production is still a key ecosystem service. It has implications in terms of pollution, there's no doubt. Sustainable livestock production is challenging, but the Welsh institutions are really active in this area in terms of research, education and training. There are limitations to sustainable intensification wherever we might be in the world. In Wales, it's topography, etc. But we do need to consider the potential for displaced production and indirect land use change. And the spatial context is massively important. Ruminant livestock, they may be polluting, but we need them to deliver those other ecosystem services. The glass tier is showing that. We need animals out there grazing land in specific ways to deliver those ecosystem services. So let's see can we combine that with the production side of things too. And there's a need to quantify these potential impacts of a range of land use scenarios on that balance between agricultural production and other ecosystem services. And we've heard about some of those methodologies already today in this room. There are a huge number of socioeconomic and policy considerations that I've not even started to talk about, but education and training and incentives are part of those. Thank you.
Good, thanks very much indeed, Dave. We've got time for a quick question while Jamie's setting up for his presentation. Question at the back. Do you want the mic or are you going to shout?
I'll shout.
Okay.
I was just wondering whether your research has looked at different types of livestock, because from a biodiversity point of view, not all animals are the same. For instance, the Ross pasture is an iconic Welsh habitat, but it relies on cattle grazing, whereas sheep grazing on Ross pasture can be actually quite damaging. So I wondered whether your research has actually looked at perhaps the drift from cattle towards more sheep as we deal with an aging farming population?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. I don't know if there's any of my colleagues in the audience who might have more knowledge. I can tell you that where I did come from, back in Devon, we did have some research that looked at the ability of not just different livestock categories, but different breeds of individual categories, so different breeds of cattle or sheep, would have on things like biodiversity. So that work has been done in the past. I can't say whether it's been done in that systematic way that you've just suggested, but I can look into it for you. Yeah.
Good, thank you very much, Dave. Really interesting. And you mentioned nutrition within the context of your presentation. And I'm very pleased that Jamie is now joining us. Jamie, an expert in nutrition,